Hello, and welcome to Deep Minutes channel, where I explore the fascinating ideas of some of the greatest thinkers in history. Today, I'm going to talk about Parmenides, one of the most influential and controversial pre-Socratic philosophers, who challenged the common sense views of his time and proposed a radical new conception of reality. Parmenides is considered the founder of the Eleatic school of philosophy, which emphasized the use of logic and reason to discover the truth and rejected the evidence of the senses as unreliable and deceptive. Parmenides' main work, On Nature, is a poem that consists of 3 parts: the prologue, the way of truth, and the way of opinion. In the prologue, Parmenides describes his journey to the realm of the goddess, who reveals to him the secrets of being and non-being. In the way of truth, Parmenides presents his metaphysical arguments for the nature of reality, based on the principle that what is, and what is not, is not. In the way of opinion, Parmenides explains the illusions and errors of the common people, who believe in the existence of change, plurality, and motion, which are all impossible according to his logic. Parmenides' philosophy is often seen as a response to the earlier philosophers, such as Heraclitus, who claimed that everything is in a constant state of flux and that nothing remains the same. Parmenides argues that change is impossible because it would imply that something comes from nothing or that something becomes nothing, which are both contradictory and absurd. Parmenides also argues that plurality is impossible because it would imply that there are many things that are and many things that are not, which are also contradictory and absurd. Parmenides concludes that there is only one thing that is, and that it is eternal, unchanging, indivisible, and spherical. Parmenides' philosophy has been widely criticized and challenged by later philosophers who tried to find ways to reconcile his logic with the apparent reality of the world. Some of the most famous critics of Parmenides was Zeno of Elea, who was his student and defender, and Plato, who was his admirer and opponent. Zeno of Elea devised several paradoxes to show that the common sense views of change, plurality, and motion lead to absurd consequences, and that Parmenides' view is the only consistent one. For example, Zeno argued that motion is impossible, because in order to move from one point to another, one has to cross an infinite number of smaller points, which would take an infinite amount of time. Plato, on the other hand, tried to find a middle ground between Parmenides and Heraclitus by distinguishing between the realm of being and the realm of becoming. Plato agreed with Parmenides that there is a higher reality that is eternal, unchanging, and intelligible, which he called the forms, or the ideas. But he also acknowledged that there is a lower reality that is temporal, changing, and sensible, which he called the appearances, or the phenomena. Plato argued that the forms are the true causes and models of the appearances, and that the appearances are imperfect copies and reflections of the forms. Plato also tried to solve the problem of non-being by introducing the concept of the third kind, or the receptacle, which is the space or the matter that allows the forms to manifest themselves in the appearances. Parmenides' philosophy is not only relevant for the history of philosophy, but also for the history of science, mathematics, and logic. Parmenides was one of the first thinkers to use deductive reasoning and to derive conclusions from premises based on the principle of non-contradiction. Parmenides also influenced the development of geometry by introducing the concept of the sphere as the perfect shape. Parmenides also anticipated some of the modern concepts of physics, such as the conservation of mass and energy and the relativity of space and time.
Parmenides' philosophy is also relevant for the contemporary debates on the nature of reality, the limits of knowledge, and the role of language. Parmenides raises some important questions such as, how can we know the truth? How can we trust our senses? How can we, express what is and what is not? How can we reconcile logic and experience? How can we account for diversity and change? These are some of the questions that Parmenides invites us to ponder and discuss, and that make his philosophy so fascinating and challenging. Here are the most famous Parmenides quotes and their meanings. One, we can speak and think only of what exists, and what exists is uncreated and imperishable, for it is whole and unchanging and complete. It was not or nor shall be different, since it is now all at once one and continuous. This quote summarizes Parmenides' metaphysical view of reality, which he calls the way of truth. He argues that there is only one thing that exists, and that it is eternal, immutable, indivisible, and spherical. He denies the possibility of non-being or nothingness and rejects the notion of change, plurality, and motion, which he considers as illusions and errors of the senses and the mind. He claims that the only way to know the truth is by using logic and reason, and that the evidence of the senses is unreliable and deceptive. To Exnihil O'Neill fit this quote meanings from nothing, nothing comes. It is a logical principle that Parmenides uses to support his argument that change is impossible. He reasons that change would imply that something comes from nothing or that something becomes nothing, which are both contradictory and absurd. He also uses this principle to deny the existence of a void or empty space, which he considers as a form of non-being. He asserts that there's no such thing as empty space and that what is always full and continuous. 3 is all one to me where I begin, for I shall come back again there. This quote expresses Parmenides' circular and holistic view of reality, which he calls the way of opinion. He explains that the common people have different opinions and beliefs about the world, which are based on the evidence of the senses and the imagination. He acknowledges that these opinions are useful and necessary for practical purposes, but he also warns that they are not true and reliable. He says that the opinions are based on the distinction between two forms, one of which is light and fire, and the other is dark and night. He says that these forms are opposite and contrary to each other, and that they are the source of all diversity and change. He also says that these forms are not separate and independent, but that they are part of a larger whole, which is the one being. He says that the opinions are circular and relative, and that they always come back to the same point, which is the truth of the one being. 4, to be and to have meaning are the same. This quote reflects Parmenides' view of the relationship between being and language, which he calls the way of signs. He argues that language is the expression of thought, and that thought is the expression of being. He says that language and thought are both based on the principle of non-contradiction, which states that what is, and what is not, is not. He says that language and thought can only refer to what is, and that what is not cannot be spoken or thought of. He says that language and thought are the signs of being, and that being and meaning are the same. 5, wherefore all these things are but the names which mortals have given, believing them to be true. This quote criticizes the conventional and arbitrary nature of language, which he calls the way of names. He points out that the common people have given names to different things such as gods, elements, animals, plants, etc., believing them to be real and distinct entities. He says that these names are not based on the nature of things, but on the opinions and preferences of mortals. He says that these names are not true and accurate, but misleading and deceptive. He says that these names are not the essence of things, but the appearance of things. 6, for never shall this prevail, that things that are not are. This quote is the main thesis of Parmenides' philosophy, which he calls the way of truth. He asserts that there is no such thing as non-being or nothingness, and that it is impossible to speak or think of it. He says that non-being is a contradiction in terms, and that it is the source of all confusion and error. He says that only being is real, and that it is the subject and object of all true knowledge and discourse. 7, it is the same thing that can be thought and that can be. This quote expresses Parmenides' view of the relationship between being and thought, which he calls the way of reason. He argues that being and thought are identical and that they are both based on the principle of identity, which states that what is. He says that being and thought are both simple and indivisible, and that they are both eternal and unchanging. He says that being and thought are both one and the same, and that they are the essence and the criterion of all reality and truth. 8, for you could not know what is not, that is impossible, nor utter it. This quote explains Parmenides' view of the limits of knowledge and language, which he calls the way of silence. He argues that knowledge and language can only deal with what is, and that they are powerless and useless when it comes to what is not. He says that what is not cannot be known because it does not exist, and that it cannot be uttered because it has no meaning. He says that knowledge and language are both silent and ignorant about what is not, and that they should refrain from attempting to grasp or express it. 9, for it is the same thing to think and to be. This quote summarizes Parmenides' view of the unity of being and thought, which he calls the way of wisdom. He argues that being and thought are not only identical, but also inseparable, and that they are both the source and the goal of all philosophy. He says that being and thought are both the origin and the end of all inquiry and understanding, and that they are both the foundation and the culmination of all wisdom. He says that being and thought are both the ultimate reality and the ultimate truth, and that they are both the supreme good and the supreme beauty. Come now, I will tell and do that hearken to my saying and carry it away are the only two ways of search that can be thought of. The first, namely, that it is impossible for anything not to be, is the way of conviction, for truth is its companion. The other, namely, that it is not, and that something must needs not be. That, I tell thee, is a wholly untrustworthy path. For you cannot know what is not, that is impossible, nor utter it, for it is the same thing that can be thought and that can be. This quote is the introduction to Parmenides' poem on nature, where he presents his two ways of search or inquiry, which he calls the way of truth and the way of opinion. He argues that there are only two possible ways of thinking about reality, and that only one of them is valid and reliable. He says that the way of truth is the way that affirms the existence of being and that denies the possibility of non-being. He says that the way of truth is the way of conviction, for it is accompanied by truth, which is the correspondence between being and thought. He says that the way of opinion is the way that affirms the existence of non-being and that denies the possibility of being. He says that the way of opinion is the way of deception, for it is accompanied by error, which is the discrepancy between being and thought. He says that the way of opinion is a wholly untrustworthy path, for it leads to ignorance and confusion. He says that the way of truth is the only way of search that can be thought of, and that he will reveal it to the reader. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new about Parmenides and his philosophy. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and leave your comments and questions below. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.